continue in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John. This is the early morning hours of Good Friday, the day of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And this morning we'll be looking at verses 12 to 27 in chapter 18. You know, we could include additional insights as we go through this that come from Matthew and Mark and Luke, because they also give an account of this story, and there are some other details that they give us along the way, but we're not going to do that today, because I think it's important for us to move straight through the text as it was written, as it was inspired today. I think we'll see some interesting things here. In this text, we have Jesus' trial and Peter's denial contrasted against each other. John goes back and forth from the trial to the denial, and he goes back and forth in that. These two monumental events happening at exactly the same time going on here. And we have from Jesus and in his glory, and we have Peter and his sin contrasting together. John's intention, always was to show the deity of Christ in the writing of his gospel. And here it shines against the backdrop of the utter failure of his most verbally committed and most self-confident follower, right, in Peter. And we see this going on. In fact, it shows us the very kind of sin for which Christ was headed to the cross at this time. Peter is sinning almost in a rapid fire, kind of an intentional way almost here. At the same time, Jesus is preparing to go to the cross to pay the price for Peter's sin that's going on. Peter's denials are terrible at every level in this. They're acts of disloyalty, cowardice, pride, fear, right? As ugly as they are, the punishment for all of these denials is going to be borne by Jesus on that cross in just a matter of a few hours. So we have, in this darkness of the night, we have the darkness of the sin contrasting to the shining of the glory of Christ there. The setting is the Mount of Olives, or the Garden of Gethsemane, more specifically within that, along that mount. Just to the east of the city of Jerusalem. Early Friday morning, Jesus is going to be crucified in just a few hours. He spent several hours now with his disciples, right? Started in the upper room, Passover meal Thursday evening as they're preparing, all the way through that process, and they walked through the streets of Jerusalem. He continued to teach them along the way. The arriving at the Mount of Olives, chapter 17, we know that Jesus spends time in prayer there. We look deep at that prayer through all of chapter 17, and that's done. He's done teaching and praying. In chapter 18, he moves directly into the point of his arrest. We looked at that last week. He's not running away or fleeing. He goes right after. Chapter 18, verse 4 said, knowing all that was going to happen, Jesus went out. He went right to where he knew that they'd be waiting for him. He knew that Judas would be there in the Garden of Gethsemane with these guys ready to arrest him there, with this force, really. He does his last miracle before he's crucified there. At that, we saw that last week, that he displays his power, and the fact that when he asked who you're looking for, and they said Jesus, and he says, I am he, and the power of his voice, the power of what he spoke, knocked him to the ground in that situation. And then we see the miracle as he creates an ear or heals that ear on the head of the servant. Side of the servant's head. But, in spite of the divine power that Jesus displays, even in that garden, they don't care. They want him. They want Jesus dead at this point. They are still resolved to arrest him and to do away with him. They don't have a need for trial as far as they are concerned. The Jewish leaders, they reached a verdict a long time ago in their minds. They've been afraid to act all week long because although Jesus has been in the temple every day, he's been around, there's also been the crowds, right? Just a few days before this, they've seen the waving of the palm branches and the hosannas and hundreds of thousands of people pouring in and singing the praises of Jesus. And they're afraid of the crowd. They know that if they do the wrong thing, the crowd will react. So they're trying to avoid that. They were afraid of the crowd. They were afraid of Jesus. Jesus had cleared the temple. He had kicked them out, right? The money changers and things. When he spoke, whenever he spoke, he confounded the Jewish leaders. They'd come and try to question him and make him look bad, and he would turn the tables on them. They were afraid of him. He answered the questions, leaving them speechless and often looking foolish. They knew about all the miracles that he'd done. They'd heard about these things, and even very recently, the raising of Lazarus in Bethany, just not far from Jerusalem. All of this was going on. Then in this very night, they've been knocked to the ground by his voice. They've seen this ear, all of this. Yet nothing changes their plan. They want him. They have in their hatred determined to arrest Jesus. And so we pick up chapter 18, beginning in verse 12 then. It says, Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You are not one of his disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have only spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I have always taught in the synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas the high priest. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, You're not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it again, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Jesus is now in the garden. He's confronted by this crowd that's come to arrest him. He's not defended by Peter or the rest of his disciples. His kingdom's not of this world, right? He tells them that later on. He says, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. His power is on his display. Willingly, Christ surrenders himself to these guys. He knew his purpose. When he came, his purpose when he came was to die. Verse 12 says that uses the word detachment of soldiers and references a commander. As we saw last week, these terms indicate a minimum of 200 Roman soldiers, a minimum of 200 with them. Could be, with the use of the word commander, up to 1,000 Roman soldiers in this entourage, along with the Jewish temple guards and the others that are there. There's a mob there, this force that has come to arrest Jesus. And at the end of verse 12, it says that they bound him. Interesting, John Calvin said the body of the Son of God was bound so that our souls might be loose from the cords of sin and Satan. In the passage, we've got 4 different scenes contrasting here. These 2 different dramas, the drama of the trial and the drama of the denial going on. Why does John tell the story this way? Well, it happened this way, number one, right? So maybe that's why. And second, we see that great contrast between our sin and God's grace and what's going on simultaneously. Jesus on the way to the cross to die for the sin of Peter, that he is committing even as Jesus is being arrested and taken. So scene 1 is the trial, verses 12 to 14. Now there's a mixed group of people here. There's Jewish leaders, and some of the Jewish people are there along the way. There's Roman soldiers. There's some Gentiles right there. All of these different people are gathered together to see this. It's a picture of humanity for all different walks of life, different backgrounds, and yet they're all alike. They're all sinners, and they're all blind to the glory of Christ that's right there in front of them. It shows an amazing hardness of heart, the indifference of the unconverted here. They've experienced sometimes firsthand, this crowd of people, the miracles of Jesus. Some of them were probably in that group that he fed on the hillside, and thousands had seen him do miracles and things, and then they told others, and hundreds of thousands knew of all of the miracles that Jesus had done. All of them have seen and heard something about that. In addition to the work, all of that that he had done, Jesus had told them, believe me for the works, but also believe me for the words. They had heard him speak, and they said, nobody speaks like this guy. It was unbelievable, the way that he spoke, and yet they're still unmoved at this point. They're ready to carry out the purpose. The plan of the Jews to take Jesus by night away from the crowd, get him outside of the city. It's also an interesting parallel to sin, isn't it? People hiding their sin in the dark, right? In secret. I want to sleep out and do this. God knows what's going on. He sees it. He knows exactly what's going on. But they arrest Jesus. Matthew tells us at this point the disciples, they flee, right? They run. They disappear. Fulfills that old prophecy that when the shepherd is stricken, that the sheep will scatter. And so that happens in this. Why do they bind him? Why do they bind Jesus? It's kind of funny because, he could have spoke a word, right? And ended that if he wanted to. They bind him first. Well, they do that with a prisoner, right? They do that today. They put him in handcuffs, whatever. They do that. So first, that would be customary when they arrest him. But second, the Jewish leaders want to show him in that captive position. They want to show he's made them look pretty bad. And they want to put him in that position. Another interesting parallel here, one of the most significant Old Testament pictures of Christ is the picture of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, right? We remember that story in Genesis 22:9. It says, Abraham, when he was about to offer Isaac, bound him to the altar. God was gracious and spared Isaac. He provided a lamb in that situation. It says, bind the sacrifice with cords onto the altar. So here, Christ, that perfect Lamb of God, is bound, getting prepared for that sacrifice. It's important to know that there's 6 aspects of this trial that unfold in there. There were 3 religious trials and 3 civil trials that happened in these few hours that are going on. To put the whole picture together, we'd have to use those other Gospels, and that's, again, it's not our purpose this morning, but 3 religious trials. He first goes to Annas. Then Annas sends him to Caiaphas, who's gathered with the Sanhedrin, and they do an illegal trial at night. And then when the sun comes up at daybreak, then those guys reconvene again to have a quick public trial because they have to do that according to the law. So there's three steps in there. The trials. The first with Annas is basically to establish, it's the preliminary hearing, the arraignment, the indictment, right? That's going on. And so that doesn't work. Annas sends him to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So that's kind of the Jewish Supreme Court, if you will. That goes on the process. So there's 3 parts then in the religious trial. There's 3 parts that we'll see later in the civil trial that takes place when they send him to Pilate, who sends him to Herod, who sends him back to Pilate, right? 6 different trials that happen. So the first, the arraignment. Annas. And who is Annas? Well, verse 19 calls him the high priest. But in verse 13, it says Caiaphas was a high priest that year, right? Is that a problem? No. And it's not, because when they refer to President Bush, right? Is he president right now? No. But he still carries the title, doesn't he, right? After they've been in, well, the high priest, kind of the same thing. He was still carrying that title. He was the former high priest, former president, etc., right? We see in that. So that's what you hear with the title. But also in the Jewish world, Numbers chapter 35 established this. There was the high priest was supposed to be a high priest for life. He was supposed to be the high priest for life. And in the process, so they would always, the Jewish people would always think of Annas as being the high priest. However, the Romans didn't like that idea, right? They thought that it gave a man too much power. If this guy stays in this position for this long, he's got too much power. And so they thought he was a threat. It's kind of like having, career-long politicians, and sometimes they get too much power. And that can be a bad thing. And that was kind of their approach to this, right? Along the way. And so the Romans instituted, while under Roman control, that they said, you got to make a new high priest every year. Somebody different every year. And they'd gone through the whole family. They'd gone through the family of Annas, the subsequent high priest Annas. 5 of his sons, 1 of his grandsons had been named in the process, and they'd run out of sons and grandsons, so now it's his son-in-law that they named as high priest that year. That's how we get to that. That's how we get to Annas and Caiaphas, who's the son-in-law, right? So they all live in kind of an area close together, the high priest, former high priest, right, with a big courtyard in the middle, where a lot of these trials take place. And so it's like we go over here. How do they have 6 trials in a night? Well, because they don't have to go very far. They drag him over here, right? And go through the process. It's in a pretty tight area that all of this is going on. Even where it says Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. That year is kind of a snide remark because, because Romans made him that year, the high priest that year in the process. Jewish leaders feared the Romans would become their enemies. The high priest, and they feared that the Romans would become their enemies and overtake their gig, wipe out what they had going on. They didn't want that, so they worked with the Romans. They allowed the taxation process and things that went on with that. They agreed to okay, we'll make a new high priest every year. They did a lot of things. They corrupted the worship to such a degree that Jesus went in and cleared the temple, right? They were doing a lot of things to get along with Romans. They didn't want any conflict because the Jewish leaders liked the power that they had. And they were doing. The temple had become a racket for the high priest family. Time of for sacrifice. People would have to bring in, and think about this, up to 250,000 sacrifices were made the week of Passover. All right? Huge numbers. And you have to bring your sacrifice and have them inspected. Oh, that doesn't pass inspection. Look, there's this flaw or that flaw in this animal. You'll have to buy one of ours. Oh, and ours are all okay. And of course, they would charge an exorbitant price, right? And skim off of that, put the money in their pockets. I like that. Oh, the other thing is that you had to pay your temple tax in our coinage. And though people came from all over, Jews scattered all over the Mediterranean area that used different coins, different things, when they came in, they said, oh no, we don't accept that currency here. You'll have to use ours. And so there were the money changers we've heard about, right? Oh, okay. And of course, they ripped them off there. They charged them a high price for that fee. And again, put money in their pockets. They had a good gig going. All right, there was a lot of things going on in that. And so the fear of the high priest, of the Jewish leaders, was that if they didn't do something about Jesus, this was going to get out of hand and they were going to lose their power. That was the fear that was going on in that. They were afraid that if things got crazy, the Romans would step in and say enough. They'd do away with things. They were going to lose their gig, maybe lose their life. We saw that back in John 11. Remember the fears address, Caiaphas in John 11:47 says, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council, and they were saying, what are we going to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. They were afraid. They were afraid they were going to lose their operation. They were afraid they were going to lose their power. They were afraid they were going to lose their money. During that meeting in chapter 11, Caiaphas said to the guys, he goes, you guys don't know anything at all. You don't understand. This isn't that hard of a problem. It's better that one man die for the whole country than we let him live and the whole country get taken over by the Romans. Now he prophesied. And verse 51 after that even tells us he didn't even know what he was saying. He didn't realize he was prophesying what would happen. He was just getting a plot to take care of Jesus. And it says after that they determined at that point, back in chapter 11, that Jesus needed to die. So that's what all was going on in that process, right? From that day on, they determined that they would kill him in verse 53 of John 11. So we see this initial thing going on. Then we shift to Act 2, from the trial that's going on here to Peter's denial. In verses 15-18, the disciples fled from the garden, but Peter and another disciple had come back through the crowd. Who's the another disciple? Well, it's John, right? Remember John? John never uses his own name anywhere in this gospel. Remember at the Lord's Supper, when they were doing the Passover meal in the upper room, and he leans back. He says that the disciple whom Jesus loved was there with him. He's referring to himself. John will tell us when they run to the empty tomb later that Peter and another disciple ran along to the tomb. He never says his name, but we know the other gospel writers tell us it was John. It's John here. So they follow, they get back in, and they're following along. But Peter's kind of lagging behind, right? This same Peter that a few hours earlier had said, hey, Jesus, I will die for you. I will go with you to whatever happens. Doesn't matter what it costs, right? That was him in chapter 13, the same night, a few hours ago, right? That he declared all of that to him, all of his bold talk and things. And verse 50, but he's following, but kind of from a distance here. And we see that they get there, and it says that the other disciple, John, goes right into the courtyard, right on into the courtyard, and Peter hangs back. John's known by the high priest. How is John known? A lot of different things could be. There were family things. John's mom was Salome, who was related to Mary, the mother of Jesus, who knew Elizabeth, right? They were cousins, and Elizabeth's husband, right? He was one of the priests. Who knows? And all of that. But John was known to the high priest. So he came on in. He realizes, oh, Peter's not here. He talks to the girl at the door and says, hey, that guy there, he needs to come on in with us. Okay. And so he's into the courtyard. But again, it's that area. There are places around this courtyard. And so he's still kind of at a distance, but he's inside close enough to kind of see what's going on at this point. And when he's coming in, this little slave girl is a gatekeeper and asks him, aren't you one of the disciples? And he replies to her, I am not. What's he afraid of? This is a slave girl. She can't do anything to him. Why does he say, I'm not? Did he fear her? He didn't fear her. He feared anything or everything at this point. All this is going on. They've arrested him. They've taken him. He's afraid. He's afraid, period. He's afraid for his own hide. Even though he just told Jesus a few hours ago, I'll die for you, now he's afraid of what's going to happen. Yeah, that's how temptation shows up so often. Right? Well, we're not planning on it. It catches us off guard. He didn't expect that girl to ask him that question coming in there. He's thinking, I can get in here. I can see what's going on. Aren't you one of the... Oh, no. Nope, not me. If we got up in the morning and there was a schedule that said, you're going to be tempted at 10:15, 12:02, right? 3:35 during this day. Be ready for those things. No, it's that you're walking in and boom, something happens and he's caught off guard. He's surprised. He's afraid because of everything going on. And so he responds quick. No, I don't know him. I don't know him. Did Peter forget what Jesus had just done for him in the garden? Saved him from being arrested. What happened to Peter? He was the guy that grabbed the sword and started hacking away, right? In the garden to protect him. Then they arrested him and he ran out. But he slipped back through the crowd to see what's going on. But now all of a sudden he's a denier and a liar. He's a follower of Jesus, but he's keeping his distance. I have a lot of Christians that want to live their life that way. Well, I believe in Jesus and stuff, but I don't want to bring that up in front of people. I don't want to get all this fanatic, go to church all the time and read my Bible kind of stuff. That's getting carried away. He was following Jesus, but from a distance. Don't miss that. Because he was too far away from Jesus. That's what got him in trouble. He's too far away from Jesus in this situation. He's trapped between his fear of what will happen to him and his love for Jesus. That's why he's there. He still loves Jesus. He doesn't want to leave because he loves the Lord, but he doesn't want to be exposed because he fears for his own safety. Verse 19, then, we shift back to the trial. Boom. Jesus' trial. Meanwhile, back at the trial, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples, about his teaching. This is a mockery of justice. The Jews, you go back and read their laws, and it follows along much like our laws in so many ways, and what's there. The point of this is the arraignment or the indictment. And when that happens, a prosecutor has to come forward and give reasons that there needs to be a trial. We have this much evidence against this person, so there should be a trial, right? That's what an arraignment, an indictment does. They should be charged. Here's the deal. There needs to be a trial. They don't ask that person at an indictment. They don't ask the person that's being they don't charge them. They don't question them. They don't question the person that's caught at that point. They have to say, we have these things that demand a trial. And they also, in the Jewish law, you weren't allowed to do that because they weren't allowed to self-incriminate. We do that. It's called the Fifth Amendment, right? I plead the Fifth. They weren't allowed to ask those questions at an indictment, at an arraignment time. But he's asking him. Jesus isn't being disrespectful. He says, I've spoken all of these places. Go ask these people what I said. In other words, show your evidence. Do this legally. You're supposed to have witnesses of all the bad things I've done. Right? That's what you're supposed to present here. At this, the high priest shouldn't have been questioning Jesus at all, but he should have been required to present charges. Those others, the others that brought him should have been presenting charges against Jesus at that time. So this is illegal in what's going on. The high priest questions Jesus in verses 20 and 21. Jesus says, like you said, I've spoken in all these places. Why are you questioning me? Question those who I've heard. Give your evidence. He's not being uncooperative. He's just trying. He's saying this is the law. The law says you're supposed to do it this way, and you're not. He knows John 15:25. He told them they hate me without reason. Jesus knew that. He knew coming in. His response is calm. And when he says this, verse 22, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? This is the first physical blow Jesus receives from the hand of a sinner. This is the first blow against his body right here that comes. He came from a Jew, came from a member of the temple police. Temple police carried a club with them. Enforce things. Micah 5:1 said, they shall strike the judge of Israel on the cheek with a rod. And again, we see a fulfilled prophecy right there in that. Even in this, Jesus is proving that he is really the judge of Israel. They're in court trying to put Jesus on trial, but really the ones that are on trial and being indicted right now are those Jewish leaders that are breaking their own laws in what's going on. Annas hates Jesus, and the people around him hate Jesus, and they see this reaction, and Jesus responds calmly, if I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? The word testify is the operative word. In other words, where's the testimony, right? That's what's supposed to be going on. Somebody else is supposed to be giving testimony here that I did something wrong. Annas couldn't handle that. It says, verse 24, that Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. He should have let him go because there were no evidence was presented. But they're not about to let Jesus go. So he says, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to send him. I'm going to send him over here to Caiaphas and see what he has to do. The Sanhedrin is assembled with Caiaphas in the chamber in the dead of night. Again, they're doing something absolutely illegal. They were not allowed to convene at night. They were not allowed to do that according to their own laws at night, and yet here they were doing that. They finally make up some charges against Jesus and accuse him of blasphemy, and then they come up with the idea because they know that they need the Romans behind them, and so then they say, well, he said he's king, so he's a threat to Caesar, so that the Romans might be afraid of him too. They trump up some charges. We shift back to scene 4, verse 25. When we left Peter in verse 18, he was standing there warming, and we go right back, and there he is, standing there warming himself by the fire. He's still there with these people that are murmuring around, who knows what they're saying. He can't, and Peter can't leave. He doesn't want to be exposed, but he wants to be there too. In verse 25 and 26, and we see that. Simon Peter said, warming himself, he was asked, you are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. Second time, right? That's number 2. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Uh-oh. This is a guy that was in the garden. He saw this happen. He recognizes Peter. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. The third time. In the black darkness, Jesus just keeps denying. Keeps denying. No one's threatening his life here. He's not being arrested by anybody. This is a slave girl at the door and some people gathered around the fire. But he denies Christ in all 3 of those times. We're going to leave John at this point. We're going to pick up there next week. I want you to flip back to Luke 22 for just a moment. Because in Luke 22, he kind of pulls this together in a way that cuts deep. Luke 22, verse 59. About an hour later came another, asserted certainly his fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. I can't even fathom how that must have shot through him. You ever have somebody, maybe it's your parents or somebody or whatever, that has that look? Maybe it's your spouse, and you're like, uh-oh, right? That's the line. That's the line, right? We know what that's like. Can you imagine upon denying him the third time and Jesus looks up? I don't think he gave him a hateful look. I don't think it was like that at all. I think he just looked at him. And that cut through. Then Peter remembered the words the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly, Luke says. That ends the phase 2 of the religious trial. The last phase comes after dawn. I told you we'll see that. It's not a trial where you don't have an indictment or a crime or witnesses, right? And you beat the person. That's not a trial. Peter's there, he's exposed, and he went out and he wept bitterly. The difference between Peter, who denied Christ 3 times, and Judas, who a few hours earlier had left that meal and gone and brought him all the people to arrest Jesus in the garden. Right? What's the difference? What's the difference between them? Well, Judas went out and hanged himself. No remorse. That turned into repentance, at least. Right? Remorse that turned into suicide. With Peter, it was remorse that turned to repentance. He went out and he wept bitterly. What was the difference between Judas and Peter? Judas hated Jesus Christ, and Peter loved him. On that basis, the Lord restored Peter. At the end of the Gospel of John, we'll see where he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Right? Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? And we know Peter's response, right? Yes, I love you. I love you, Lord. And then he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Right? Jesus asked him 3 times, once for each of the times that he denied him, to restore him. And Jesus restored him to ministry, and Peter preached that great sermon on the day of Pentecost. And the first half of the book of Acts is Peter proclaiming that message. This is a wonderful reality of the passage. Here is a disciple sinning epically, right? People know about Peter denying Christ. People that don't go to church, people that they've heard of, they know of that story. Like no previous sin, recorded in the gospel at least. And this sin on all accounts would be enough to say Peter's nothing more than just another Judas denying Christ. Instead, he becomes the great gospel preacher at that day of Pentecost. Peter's a picture of all of the people that Christ died for. It's a perfect picture of that going on. While Jesus is actually going to the cross, he's actually in the process of them mock trials of being put on the cross. Peter is denying him. Peter is sinning. Boom, boom, boom. Right along the way. It's a perfect picture for each of us to understand. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. What an incredible picture that we see here. What can we learn from Peter? One, that we're weak. We're weak. We're susceptible to sin. Don't be self-confident. Don't go to sleep at a prayer meeting. Remember Peter and James and John, they'd fallen asleep while Jesus was praying 3 times. He went back and woke them up each time. Don't fall asleep there. Don't hang around dangerous people. He's hanging around that fire with all these people that can't wait to see Jesus killed. And don't give in to fear. He was afraid what would happen to him if he said, yes. Yeah, I'm one of his disciples. Absolutely. I'm maybe his best disciple. No, it's like, I don't know him. I don't know. He was afraid. But listen, here's the deal. If you sin, ask the Lord for forgiveness. Tell the Lord that you love him. And he'll lift you up and use you for great things. That's what we see in this account with Peter. Father God, what an amazing passage.